Have you ever felt lost, even while standing in the middle of a crowd? Have you ever looked back at your life and wondered, am I truly living or just repeating meaningless routines? In a small village in the countryside of India, there was a young man named Ranak. He wasn't poor, but he wasn't wealthy either. Not unattractive, but not particularly striking. Yet, everyone in the village knew his name. Not because of talent, but because of the reckless and rebellious lifestyle of a young man who lived by one motto: try everything once just to know. He lived as if tomorrow didn't exist, waking up with the taste of last night's alcohol still lingering, wandering the market in the afternoon, flirting with new women. And by night, there was never a shortage of laughter, loud music, and empty promises. To the world around him, Ranak had it all: money, freedom, and even the envy of others. But inside, there was an emptiness he couldn't quite name. Until one quiet afternoon, on his way home from yet another party, Ranak heard a voice ring out in the village square. If a man keeps planting seeds in barren soil, can he ever expect a fruitful harvest? The voice was as light as the wind, but it stirred something inside him, something that had been asleep for a very long time. And from that moment, a journey began. A journey he never expected. A man who once lived in indulgence would become a light for an entire generation. This story isn't just for those who have been lost. It's also for those who are still walking, yet have never asked themselves, am I walking in the right direction? Sit with me, take a deep breath, and begin the journey with Ranak, the one who walked from the path of desire to the path of awakening. After that afternoon, when Ranak first heard the strange voice echo through the village square, nothing felt the same. He continued living as before, the parties, the women, the empty jokes. But inside, a quiet emptiness began to grow. No one noticed. Only he, lying alone at night in a room filled with nothing but the sound of wind, could feel his heart grow heavy, without knowing why. Ranak wasn't poor. He had everything most young men dreamed of. Money from his family's shop, admiration from his friends, and fleeting romances without attachment. But he also began to realize, each thing he had only made him feel emptier. It was like drinking seawater to quench a thirst. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. The more you try to fill the void, the deeper it grows. One evening, after a night of partying that ended earlier than usual, Ranak returned home. He sat in the dark, watched the flickering oil lamp, and whispered, "Why do I feel so alone in the middle of all this?" No one answered. Only the cold wind slipped through the cracks in the window, silent and real. You see, we live in a world that encourages indulgence. Just chill. Forget about tomorrow. Life is meant to be enjoyed. Modern mantras that sound like freedom, but how many dare to sit still and ask, the thing I'm chasing, does it really make me happy? A new car, a wild party, a fleeting embrace, all promise something called pleasure. But no one tells you, pleasure without meaning is just a gentle intoxication, and in the morning, you wake up even more drained. So what's the small lesson here? Pleasure isn't bad, but pleasure without purpose becomes a prison. Indulgence doesn't lead to freedom. It only pulls you further away from yourself. And that's what was happening to Ranak. Day by day, night by night, he drifted farther from a self he had never truly explored. No one forced him. No one judged him. He simply chose to close his eyes to the truth. But every escape must eventually come to an end. And the moment of reckoning arrived, in a way he never expected. One day, in the noise of the village market, Ranak once again heard that familiar voice. This time, he didn't walk away. He stopped, stood quietly in the crowd, and began to listen. That evening, Ranak walked past the village square where a crowd had gathered beneath the old Bodhi tree. Usually, he would have walked by, quickly, indifferently, as if there was nothing there meant for him. But this time his feet stopped, not out of curiosity, but because something in his heart trembled with an unfamiliar rhythm. Under the tree, a man in saffron robes sat silently. His face was gentle, his eyes radiant, not piercing, but embracing the entire crowd in calm presence. The Buddha. He did not shout. He did not scold. He did not threaten. He simply spoke, with a voice as calm as a morning lake. People do not die from hunger. They die from not knowing they are hungry. The crowd fell silent. So did Ranak. He didn't fully understand, but something sharp and soft seemed to pierce his chest. When the teaching ended, the Buddha stepped down, walking through the crowd, and stopped in front of Ranak. Without asking anything, he simply smiled and said, "What is your name, child?" Ranak lowered his head, feeling, perhaps for the first time, small in the presence of someone who needed no authority to possess great influence. I am Ranik, and I'm not sure who I am anymore. He spoke. No exaggeration. No defense. Just a simple confession. His life had been a series of indulgences, chasing pleasure, and running from the emptiness inside. The Buddha listened, not interrupting, not judging. Only after a long silence did he speak words that stunned Ranik. You are not only wasting your time, you are wasting the very seed of life the universe entrusted to you. Each time you squander it, you deny the sacred responsibility that life asks of you. Ranik was struck. No one had ever spoken to him about life like that. Until then, sex to him had only meant pleasure, never a sacred form of energy. Life, Ranik, does not begin merely in a physical moment. It begins in the awareness of taking responsibility for that life. When you connect your body with your heart and your understanding, you will discover love, not just desire. Not everything you do is meaningless. But if you don't know why you do it, you've severed the thread that connects you to your true self. The Buddha's words that day weren't just a teaching. They were like the first bell tolling in the middle of Ranik's long dream. He didn't change overnight, but for the first time, he wanted to. That night, Ranik didn't go to a party. He walked alone along a quiet village path, where the moonlight shimmered like the Buddha's words still echoing in his mind. And in that silence, a question began to form. If I truly want to live differently, where do I begin? Since the conversation with the Buddha, Ranik was no longer the same. Not because he changed instantly, but because he began to reflect on things he had never been taught before. That night, he sat alone on the steps. No alcohol, no laughter, only the quiet moonlight shining upon the new thoughts stirring inside him. Is sex just an instinctive act, or is it a language of the soul? How many bodies have I touched, but never once touched a heart? He recalled the Buddha's words. Sex is not wrong. It is sacred when placed within the space of love, responsibility, and understanding. And then Ranik realized, all these years he had lived like a collector of pleasures. He thought he was powerful because he could have anyone he wanted. But in truth, he was simply avoiding the fear of real love. Because when you truly love someone, you don't just offer your body. You offer your wounds, your vulnerability, and your fear of being left behind. And that takes far more courage than any conquest. Ranik began observing the world around him. He saw couples holding hands, not saying a word, yet their eyes filled with trust. He saw a young husband tenderly caring for his sick wife, without complaint. And he understood. The body may be shared with many, but the true heart, it can only be reached by one person, if you're still enough to feel it. Today, we live in an age where sex is commercialized, turned into entertainment. You can match with someone in a single swipe on a screen. But the easier it comes, the harder it is to keep. Because without a thread of shared values and deep understanding, everything fades like mist. What's the lesson here? Sex is not just an act. It is a deep connection between two souls, expressed through the body. And only when you learn to respect yourself, can you truly respect another. From that day forward, Ranik made a quiet promise to himself. I will no longer use sex to fill my loneliness. I will use understanding and sincere love to build a connection that lasts. No one told him to do that. No law, no punishment. He simply didn't want to trade the newfound peace within him for the emptiness of his old ways. But no matter how much we understand, change is never easy. In the days that followed, Ranik lived between two worlds. One was the old habits calling, familiar and effortless. The other was the new path, lonely, uncertain, but full of hope. And it was precisely in that space between those two selves that Ranik began to feel something profound. True transformation always begins with the loneliness of letting go. Change, they often say, is a journey worth taking. But what few ever say is that it can also be the loneliest journey of all. After Ranik gave up his old lifestyle, the endless parties, the fleeting relationships, his life grew quiet in a strange, unfamiliar way. No more invitations, no more familiar pats on the back. Just long afternoons where he would sit on the porch, watching the sun lean across the fields and quietly wonder, am I on the right path, or am I slowly disappearing from the life I once knew? That loneliness wasn't sadness. It felt more like a fog, where you no longer see anyone ahead, and you can't turn back either. Sometimes old temptations returned. A familiar glance from a girl he used to know, an invitation to escape for a few days, a cold night that stirred old habits. And Ranik wrestled with himself. No one saw it, There was no reward for the times he said no. Only silence, and the question that echoed in his mind again and again. What am I gaining from this? That is the silent battle many people face when they step onto the path of change. No fireworks, no celebration, just you, and only you, sitting in the stillness, waiting for yourself to become someone new. You start eating healthier, walk away from toxic relationships, stop chasing money at any cost. And then one day you realize you no longer have anyone to talk to. Not because the world has abandoned you, but because you are no longer the person the world once knew. What's the lesson here? Loneliness after change is not a sign you've taken the wrong path. It's proof that you've left behind the old. It's the quiet space between two heartbeats, before your new self has fully arrived. And in that space, something magical begins. One day, as Ranok sat quietly beneath the old Bodhi tree, where he had once heard the Buddha speak, a young woman passed by. She struggled with a large basket of water, her forehead beaded with sweat, her face dusty from the road, but her eyes were as bright as the morning sun. Ranok stood up, not out of obligation, but because something in his heart stirred. He stepped forward, offered his hand, and when she looked up, both of them realized something very real had just begun. That meeting wasn't planned, but it was the answer to all the lonely days Ranok had walked through. Because sometimes, when you stop running to find someone, you finally meet the one who's walking the same direction as you. That day, when Ranok reached out to help the woman with her basket of water, he had no idea that such a small gesture would become the doorway to an entirely new world. They talked. At first, it was casual, about the rice season, the village well running low, the upcoming market. But soon, their conversation reached deeper layers. About values, about loneliness, about the kind of choices no one else understands, but you know in your heart are right. Ranok looked at her, a woman with no makeup, no polished words. Yet everything she said was gentle and full of weight. He didn't need to try to be interesting. She didn't need to be attractive in the conventional sense. And that honesty made both of them feel at ease. That day, Ranok didn't just feel heard. For the first time, he felt understood. They began seeing each other more often. Sometimes helping villagers. Sometimes sitting by the river, saying nothing at all, but never feeling awkward. And slowly, Ranok began to understand something he had never truly grasped before. Love is not possession. It's two souls walking side by side, in freedom, responsibility, and empathy. These days, many enter relationships to escape loneliness, not to find harmony. They choose each other because it's time, because everyone else has someone, or because being alone is scary. But over time, a lack of shared values causes them to lose themselves in the very relationship they sought for comfort. Ranok didn't want that. He knew, if he had once traded himself away for empty pleasures, then this time, he would choose a relationship rooted in shared values, not appearances. What's the small but powerful lesson here? When you change, the way you love also changes. You no longer seek someone who makes you feel intoxicated, but someone who makes you feel peaceful in their presence. True love doesn't come to make you feel more. It comes to help you feel enough. Ranok and the woman weren't overly romantic nor dramatic. But day by day, step by step, they built something simple yet strong. A relationship where each could keep their identity and still move forward together. A few years later, they married, had a son, and Ranok, the man who once lived for fleeting pleasure, now found true happiness in the simplest things. A warm meal, a bedtime story, and a heart that no longer needed to run from anything. As time passed, Ranok was no longer the lonely young man obsessed with fleeting pleasures. He had become a gentle husband, a calm father, and more than that, a man who lived with depth. Every morning he meditated beneath the Bodhi tree, where years ago he had first heard the Buddha's teachings. Each evening he told stories to his son, not through long lectures, but through the story of his own life. The boy often asked, "Father, why did you change?" And Ranok would smile, "Because someone once believed I could live differently." Ranok never forced anyone to follow his path. But slowly, people from the village began coming to him, not because he was wealthy, but because there was something peaceful in his eyes. Young men would sit beside him, asking about life, about desire, about love. He didn't preach. He simply shared, each mistake, each fall, and what he had learned in rising again. A man once addicted to pleasure found awareness. A woman broken by marriage rediscovered her sense of worth. A boy confused by his parents' divorce began learning how to listen. And Ranok realized, the greatest legacy you leave in life isn't wealth or fame, but the hearts you've touched with sincerity. Real-life example asterisk. In any society, there are always teachers who never stand on a stage. They simply live by their values, and their way of living becomes a quiet light for others to follow. You can be one of those people. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest with your own journey. Others will feel that. What's the small but powerful lesson here? Personal transformation is the root of community transformation. When you live aligned with your values, you plant seeds for the next generation, not with your words, but through your way of being. At the end of his life, Rannoch didn't leave behind a mansion, a brand, or a statue. He left a story, a journey from darkness to light, from selfishness to love, from instinct to awakening. And in the end, when Rannoch closed his eyes in the arms of his loved ones, he wasn't afraid, because he knew his life had been lived fully, and it would live on in the hearts he had once touched. Many years passed, and Rannoch's hair had turned completely white. The hands that were once strong now trembled slightly as he lifted a bowl of rice. But his eyes, still bright, still calm, remained like a lake no longer stirred by the wind. That day came, not rushed, not tragic, just life, gently closing a chapter. He called his loved ones to gather around his bed, like a family reunion. No one cried, no one panicked. There was only a sacred silence, as if everyone could feel. He was about to leave, but leaving nothing behind undone. Rannoch held his son's hand, smiled, and said, "I once lived very wrongly, but then I learned. No one expects you to be perfect. You just have to be honest with your journey, and know how to return when you've gone astray." He looked around, the modest home, a few hand-drawn pictures from his grandchildren, an old tea table, and said, "I once thought my life would shine with gold and silver, but in the end, what I treasure most are the moments I lived truthfully." Real-life example asterisk. So many people on their deathbeds don't regret not buying one more car. They regret not loving more, not forgiving in time, and not living true to themselves. Rannoch took nothing with him, not money, not fame, but he left behind a presence, a feeling that everyone around could sense. He had lived well, and he was leaving in peace. What's the small but powerful lesson here? In the end, no one counts how many assets you had. What they remember is, were you there when they needed you? Did you live authentically, or did you just play a role? Did you leave behind lightness or burdens? And if you're asking yourself, how can I have an ending like Rannoch's? The answer is, you don't have to wait until the end of your life to live differently. You can begin today. Every word, every action, every choice is a small stone building your legacy. When Rannoch closed his eyes, he had no fear, because he knew his final breath was not a full stop, but a comma, so that what he had planted could continue to bloom in the hearts of others. And so, Rannoch's journey came to a close, not with thunder, but with a deep, peaceful breath, like the final drop of dew dissolving into the morning sun. From a reckless young man, he became someone who lived for others, who loved with awareness, who understood that true value lies not in what we possess, but in what we give. You may be watching this video and see a part of yourself in Rannoch, chasing something vague, wandering in search of meaning, or simply feeling the absence of something deeper in life. If so, remember this: it is never too late to change. No one is born perfect, but everyone has the right to walk toward the light. A gentle reflection before you go. What are you truly living for today? Are you using your time, energy, and talents for things that matter? And one day, when you look back, will you be proud of the life you lived? Life doesn't ask you to be someone great. It simply asks you to live sincerely, keep learning, and dare to love. Because sometimes just one small shift in your heart today is enough to create an entirely different future. If you feel that this story touched you in some way, feel free to leave a comment below. Share a value you want to live by, or one thing you want to change starting today. And if you believe someone out there might need a little light too, share this video with them. Thank you for listening. May you always find the light within yourself, no matter how many turns the path may take. See you again in the next story on Buddha's Pathway.